are thrilled as always that you are taking some of your Friday to spend time with us in Music Cities Together Live, a conversation program about music in cities and responding to the COVID crisis and music ecosystems and cultural infrastructure and advocacy and research and everything else that we talk about. We do this program every Friday, and again, we appreciate you spending some time with us. We know you're very busy and a lot of things to do. Music Cities Together Live is a co-production of Music Policy Forum and Sound Music Cities. Thanks as always to our partners at Georgetown University for letting us use their Zoom platform, and our producer, Alex Dolvin. We have a super great panel of guests today, all from Colorado. Today's the Colorado Takeover. That has nothing to do with the fact that all of us would rather be in Colorado in July instead of where we are joining from. But it does have a lot to do with the work that that state does in terms of the integration of public policy and policymakers and advocates and researchers and the creative sector to really align and work together to try to create the strongest possible cultural ecosystems in that state. So we're excited about our guests. A couple updates since we were off last week and some housekeeping. I want to shout out, Alex is going to put a couple of items in the chat as we reference them. Some news from the UK in previous programs. Many of you have heard from our friend and colleague and partner, Mark David. Mark was part of an effort, Mark and Beverly and the entire Music Venue Trust team was part of a broad-based effort that got some great news this past weekend as the United Kingdom has committed approximately $2 billion in direct aid to support the cultural industries in this time of difficulty and crisis. So a huge shout out of congratulations to Mark and Beverly and everybody who worked so hard to make that happen. Here in the States, of course, as we've talked about virtually every week, we are anticipating one more round of stimulus funding, which we feel like is more likely than not coming together over the next 3 weeks. As we said before, very rarely in the music community do you have a dynamic which is essentially binary, where if one thing happens, you have one set of circumstances. If another thing happens, it's a different set of circumstances. Our good friends at the National Independent Venue Association have spurred a tremendous amount of organizing and activism and outreach and direct advocacy to help make the case to ask Congress to support our venues and put money into the live music ecosystem in this time of crisis. Again, Alex has put the website to link to that campaign. You can go to nivasos.org/takeaction. If you have not had a chance to weigh in, please do so. Tell your friends, tell your colleagues. This is going to be an incredibly important series of votes happening later this month. And again, from the standpoint of the live music economy, if there's funding, there's one set of possibilities. If there's not funding, it's going to be a very different story. Which goes to the third piece, which we don't have to dwell on. We'll talk a bit about in today's conversation. But obviously in the last 2 weeks, the news around reopening live music has not been good. It's been awful. And we've seen the curve was not crushed. The curve has rebounded. The curve is not curving. We have a tremendous number of cases across the country in most states still growing. And we don't know what that means. Again, when we began this programming back in March, we were cautiously optimistic that we were looking at a 4 to 6 month crisis for live entertainment and for the music community. Now we have no idea how long this is going to be. And so not only is it going to be important that we think about issues related to funding and just being able to stay alive, we are continuing our work with the Reopen Every Venue Safely program. Many of you attending today's program are working with the local Revs pilot city, and we'll be hearing from one of the Denver co-leads later in today's program. The Revs cities are all working incredibly hard to navigate the complexity of preparing to reopen as safely and as quickly as possible and communicating those dynamics to music workers and to audiences, while also recognizing that in most of our cities, really what we need are people to stay home, and we're not ready to reopen. So it's a very complicated time. We'll talk a little bit about what's happening in Denver with Lisa Gedgaudas later in the show. Last thing I want to shout out before we bring in our guests is another piece of good news out of Washington, D.C. We've featured in previous programs our friend and colleague, Marianne Lombardi, who gave us a heads up about some really exciting mental health programs and other workshops that are coming out of DC government to help provide resources and support for the creative workers, the creative industries. Alex just put some links into the chat, which hopefully you'll be able to access. But there's a whole set of webinars and other information sessions helping support the mission of tool building for creatives, and also, again, this expanded mental health services that are being offered in partnership with George Washington University. So we're thrilled about that. So that's a lot of housekeeping, and now we're going to move into our conversation. Again, we have three really dynamic and exciting people from the state of Colorado that are all working at the intersection, again, of research and advocacy and public sector. And I'm going to start by bringing in Margaret Hunt from Colorado Creative Industries. Margaret, are you with us?
Yes. Hi, Michael.
Awesome. We're so glad you're with us today. Margaret, I'd like to start really thinking big picture and talking big picture, because a lot of our audience members are not from the United States. They may not be familiar with what state arts agencies do. They may not be familiar with the specific particular mission of Colorado Creative Industries. Could you just start with us today, talk big picture about what CCI is, what do you see as your mission, and even thinking before the pandemic, what are the types of programs and services that you offer as a state agency?
Sure. So Colorado Creative Industries is a combination of a designated state arts agency as well as an economic and community development organization. We are housed in the Governor's Office of Economic Development and International Trade. So we fill really two roles. One is supporting job creation in the creative industries, the creative sector, as well as providing support, as most traditional state arts agencies do, by providing grants and support with funding from the National Endowment for the Arts. So some of our programs include things like career advancement grants for people who are employed in the creative industries. We do research, and I know we're going to be talking about some of that research. What we really value are the collaborations and partnerships we have with key organizations in the state, like Denver Arts and Venues, like Colorado State University, in joining together and linking arms in doing research that has a broad reach and an important impact in our state. We certify arts districts and creative districts. We provide all kinds of grants, and we've really pivoted because of COVID, and maybe we can talk about that a little bit later, to raise new sources of funding in support of people and organizations who've been affected by the pandemic.
One of the things, Margaret, I think is so impressive about the work that you've helped catalyze at CCI and others have done at the city level or at the institutional level is really think about the interconnected nature of all the resources and assets inside the state and how those can be sort of brought together to align in a way that is helpful not only for the non-commercial sector, but also to help build out the creative industries and the commercial side of things. Could you speak a little bit about how CCI as an agency has really brought that sort of intention to bear over the last number of years about like how can the state be as strategic as possible to figure out what those assets are and resources and how to help facilitate putting them together in ways that can create bigger things than if everybody was working just totally independently on their own?
Well, I would say that a foundational piece of our work is the establishment of a statewide network of individuals and organizations that can provide us with input about the issues and challenges that they are facing in their local communities across the state. And so our strategies are really built upon gaps in services and sort of the current state of affairs as far as challenges and opportunities in our state. And then with that information, we work collaboratively to advance public policy and programs that can be responsive to the needs of our communities.
Could you just brag a little bit about a couple of the programs that you've been particularly excited that your team and your network have helped either galvanize or help sort of take to a different level?
Sure. So in 2011, the state legislature gave us the authority to certify arts and creative districts across the state. And the legislation called for us to immediately certify 2 districts. So that was done in 2012. 8 years later, we have 26 certified creative districts in our state. And really what that means is that communities and neighborhoods have decided that they want to embrace creativity as their community and economic development driver, right? And so it's really interesting when we look at data that has come out of the National Endowment for the Arts and other research, that Colorado ranks #1 in the nation for the percentage of adults who are engaged in creative pursuits. So it's not surprising then that so many of our neighborhoods and communities have decided to pursue creative industries as their vision for the future and the communities that they want to live and work in. So one of the challenges has been that we are a small and mighty staff, and because of the pandemic and because of the loss of state revenues, we are just having to become more creative and cuts in our budget. We've had to become more creative in establishing partnerships with people and organizations to make our small amount of funding go further.
And one last question before we turn to the less fun part of the agenda, which is the 2020 part of the agenda. But just speaking broadly, I've always been impressed by the interest and the focus that you put on knowledge exchange and working with other state leaders and trying to really strengthen networks, so you're not just looking insularly inside the state, but you're broadening out to collaborate with other state leaders and try to share best practices and strategies and troubleshooting challenges and things like that. Could you speak a little bit about to the broader networks and for people who are participating in today's meeting, the kind of conversations that might be having at the state level in their communities that they may not be aware of or could be tapping into?
Sure. So every state has a designated state arts agency, and we have an association in which we're very actively participate with states all across the country and share best practices and solve problems together, learn from one another. It's a very strong peer learning network. Interestingly, out of that, and particularly because of the results of the election in 2016, one of the issues that came forward was this realization that small and rural communities across the country felt disenfranchised and disconnected from what was happening at the state policy level. And so we worked with the National Governors Association to develop some policy recommendations, and this information was provided to all the governors. And it was a collective research effort by the National Governors Association, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. So if someone was interested in looking at that really compelling information and research, they could go to the National Governors Association network. And I think it's called the Rural Prosperity Report, utilizing arts and culture as a community and economic development driver.
That's awesome. So let's turn the conversation to what we don't want to talk about, which is Yay 2020. It's been a hard year for everybody. I know it's part of the it's a wonderful gift to be able to do this program every week and talk to arts advocates and leaders and musicians and policymakers. And it's always crushing to kind of think about all of the plans and all of the initiatives and all of just the forward momentum that has been lost because of the shutdown and the pandemic and just the scale of human loss. And so we try not to dwell on that. But you've done something which is, I think, really important, a couple of things that are really important. And we're going to talk a little bit later with you, and we'll bring in Lisa Gedgaudas from Denver to talk about some specific responses that you're having for your creative sector. But before we get to that, you recognize the importance, you and others, and I always want to hold up, there are very few one-person bands in this sector. So you and your team and your collaborators recognize that we can't just be making decisions about the future based on an intuitive gut sense of what we think is happening in terms of the scale of the economic impact. And so you actually were able to work with others to commission some quantitative research to really get into the weeds in terms of what has this meant for the state of Colorado. Could you speak about that a little bit, and then we'll bring in the lead researcher who can talk about some of the findings and data that they've been able to collect?
Sure. So really we started off with looking at the music sector, and we built upon some research that Denver Arts and Venues had done around music, and realized that there was would be really beneficial to take a broader look at that statewide. So that was sort of the beginning of a really strong collaboration between the state and the city of Denver. And then following on that, we're doing a couple of other interesting things. We're doing some research on the future of film, as well as the most recent report that just came out that I know we're going to talk about, which is the creative economy and the impact that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on the creative economy in our state.
Yes, so this is brand new research, which is going to be publicly available in the next week or two, you anticipate? Soonish?
Yes, I think it's, I don't know, I'll let Michael.
All right, we'll let Michael.
But I think it's going to be, I have a copy, so, I'm willing to share it.
Awesome. So, Margaret, thank you. We'll bring you back into the conversation to respond to what we hear from Michael Seaman, who we are thrilled to have join us. Michael is a professor at Colorado State University. Alex will put his bio into the chat. I think more importantly, Michael is an indie rock lifer. And we also are going to put into the chat the Bandcamp link where you can download, access music from his band that has been toiling away in the underground for more years than he'd like to admit. But Michael, thank you for joining us today. It's great to see you.
Hello.
There you are.
Hi.
Hey there.
How are you?
We are fine. We're just getting through 2020. So before we get in the weeds on some data, let's just start, big picture. And if you don't mind, just talk a tiny bit about your background. What are the types of things that you like to look into as a researcher? What are the kind of questions you're asking? What's some of the things you've done previously, just to give some context?
Sure. Mainly what I focus on is the music industry and also the broader creative economy. But in terms of not just economics, but also community development, like the value of music scenes as an economic driver, but also as an incubator for innovation, new business formation, community development. And then I've started to look at that more broadly. I look at a lot of this all across the country, but also places like Singapore, China, and just really kind of thinking about what does creative economy 2.0 look like? It's not just about dollars, it's about the stories behind the dollars and how everything's becoming integrated.
And how did you get into that work? So you've got an interesting background. So you've worn different industry hats. You've again played in bands. How did you get to where you are today?
Sure. Well, I'll give you the thumbnail sketch.
Yes, please.
I worked for years in what would be like business development at Creative Artist Agency in Hollywood. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, I had been playing punk rock bands forever, and started another band 18 years ago, and decided that, I started seeing things change. This is back when the internet was brand new, and I had a feeling this was going to be a big thing. So I ended up going back to get my graduate degrees, but I was very fascinated in how the arts, music especially, integrate within cities. So I worked on my dissertation, which looked at Denton, Texas's music scene, and I showed how basically music scenes operate like the Harvard economist Michael Porter, his theory of economic clusters. And a handful of us were doing that around the world, and then the Music Cities, Shane started Music Cities, yourself, you have the Music Cities Together, what we're doing today. And there's a couple of people in other places, England and such, and across the country, they're looking at this. And I met Richard Florida through that, and we have worked together on several things. We're working together on a project now. And so it just kind of all happened, and there's no path in my flight. I, again, played in an indie rock band for 18 years now, so it's been fun. It's been great. I don't compartmentalize my life.
I like that you saw that the internet was going to be a big thing. Yeah,
I had an inkling.
Just
I didn't create. I'm no Al Gore.
Yeah, right. No. Well, I love that about your background, because I think it's always helpful. People who are creators, people who create. I don't know if you would self-identify as art, but you create for the sake of creating, for community, and because it's fun, and because you have something to say, and you want to do it, and you want to be part of the scene, and you've been on the industry side, so you understand sort of what the more traditional, it's not fair to pigeonhole Hollywood, but kind of what the mechanics of the larger industry can look like from a business standpoint, and then to be able to put that through sort of a quantitative researcher lens. And also, I'm thrilled. Let's just talk a tiny bit about what you're doing at Colorado State in terms of your teaching and the program that's coming together up there.
Sure. I'm here to help push even wider open to the entire world the arts management program. It's a graduate program where you can receive a degree in arts management, where we look at everything from the creative economy to how to market yourself, how to be better at running an arts organization, or if you're a solo artist and you just want to manage your career in a more efficient way, we'll give you those tools. We use the whole university. It's the LEAP Institute for the Arts at Colorado State University, and you can either be a student here in Fort Collins, which is great. I teach a great class in the creative economy that incorporates people from Fort Collins, so you get hands-on experience. Or you can take our degree online, and that's fascinating too, because then your cohort is literally all over the world, and it's a great lab to speak. So it's been great, and we're really looking forward to our incoming class is robust this year, so we're very happy.
Well, thank you. Thank you for all that background. So similar to Margaret, as much as I'd rather talk about this stuff, I think we need to pivot to sort of the realities of what 2020 has meant and does mean. Again, for people participating in today's program, if you have a question, there's a little Q&A box you can click on and put questions into there. We'll take as many of those as we can in the next half hour. But so Michael, talk a little bit about your research, and why don't you start with what you're trying to solve, and I think you're going to share a couple slides with us, right?
Sure. Yeah, let me share my screen. This is always a gamble.
Yeah, get those windows closed.
I think we'll do it.
Yikes.
And there we go. Basically, I started working on how to quantify the Colorado's creative economy for CCI and Margaret, as well as Lisa at Denver Arts and Venues. This was before the COVID crisis. So what we're looking at is what the creative economy looked like in the state of Colorado, 2019. And you have about 191,000 jobs. That's about 5% of the jobs in the state, which is about normal for a creative economy in the state. Sales revenue, $31.6 billion. About 4% of the state's overall sales. Again, about normal. It's robust. It's one of the stronger creative economies within the United States. And it's spread out, as you can see, through 9 different industry clusters that I put together. But far and wide in Colorado, the performing arts dwarf pretty much every other industry cluster. We are very good at hosting and performing events. The music industry alone is about 16,000 jobs and sales revenue of 1.4 billion. And of that 1.4 billion, well over half of that is people that host live music events, concerts, people to play the events, musicians. We're very, very strong in that. Unfortunately, COVID-19 crisis happened. Mm-hmm. So what I did was I quickly but thoroughly put together a model to anticipate. I had so many calls asking, what do we do? How should we approach this? How bad is this? Again, all of my friends work in the entertainment industry at some capacity, and I knew this was bad. So creating a model, had informal interviews with people in the industries, prospective published outlets, private firms, government agencies, talked with people there. I incorporated the effects of local and statewide stay-at-home, safer-at-home orders, the closing of non-essential businesses. This was very important, estimating the fact that all live events at full capacity, probably not going to happen until 2021 at the earliest. That there would be access to stimulus funds for firms, establishments, the self-employed. I estimated that there would be a 24% contraction of the entire U.S. economy, and an average of a 14% unemployment. That was, again, through trolling through documents, government documents, publishing for different agencies, and that seemed to be a pretty honest attempt at it. I included people that would be laid off, furloughed, and those that working freelance who lost gigs. With all that, and then I also estimated in a conservative manner, I then went back and selected the 111 industries in the 9 industry clusters that we had already deemed as the creative economy for the state, as well as the city of Denver. And I applied all of this as a model to each one of those industries and thought, realistically, how is this going to affect? What's going to affect a music promoter is going to be different than what affects someone who is a culinary artist in a food truck. And it's very different, but both very, very important. This is what I came to find. As an estimation, between April 1st and July 31st only, Colorado's creative economy will lose almost 60,000 jobs. We will experience a loss of $2.6 billion in sales revenue, and that is about 31% of all employment in Colorado's creative economy, and about 8% of the annual sales revenue, just within those 4 months. And again, I was being very conservative. Music, theater, dance, and visual arts, the performing arts basically, and where the music industry lives, represents 50% of all jobs lost and 31% of all sales revenue that disappears. Now let's drill down and look specifically at the music industry. This is basically carnage, total carnage. I'm estimating around 8,000 jobs and 345 million in sales revenue gone within those 4 months. Basically, there's no work. There's no work at any level of the industry. In Denver, you're looking at, again, about 50%, 4,500 jobs lost, and around 213 million in sales revenue. I'm also looking at this across the country, and this is what you're looking at in every single state. This is just one state out of 50. Now, go ahead.
No, go.
Oh, some points to think about. This does not include any multipliers. Generally, when you look at something like this, if you put $1 into an economy or you have a job in an economy, if you take that out, you're going to lose a ripple effect. You're going to lose dollars elsewhere. You're going to lose a job elsewhere. All you have to do is look at South by Southwest. That was a crushing blow to that city because so many other industries support the industries involved in putting on South by Southwest. I didn't include that in my figures. So think about that. There's a ripple effect going on. Many of these people that have lost their jobs in the creative industry also work in other jobs in the creative industry that are now gone, or work in something like the food and beverage industry, and that job is gone. So this is a sea that's crashing waves on all sides. This is not your typical recession. This is much, much worse. And also think too, let's say I wasn't even conservative enough, even at half this, it is still a serious problem, and we absolutely have to do something swiftly and quickly.
Well, thanks everybody for joining. We'll see you next. No, I'm kidding. It's like, what do you even do with that, right? I mean, well, thank you, and thanks to everybody who has been involved in this project. I mean, I think it's sobering and overwhelming, but it's absolutely vital. And again, we'll take some, if anybody has questions, throw them in the Q&A window, and we can take some of them as we're talking through this and unpacking this a little bit. So one question is, when you quantify sales now, how do you define that in terms of Colorado? Because you have, I would imagine, some revenues in the music industry are locally based, so they're transactional based. So I'm selling a T-shirt, I'm selling a concert ticket.
Right.
Are you including licensing revenue for like sync ads? Are you including like digital royalties, like the 3 pennies you get from Spotify? Like, how do you think about that?
Yes, the data I use collects all of that. So if you are a concert promoter, all the revenue that comes in that you are listing on your taxes, things like that, that is captured. So if you're a band and you are selling T-shirts at a show, if you are a band gaining up, Spotify streaming, however little that would be, that is captured.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. And you mentioned more to come in terms of other markets that you've looked at. Could you speak a little bit about what we can anticipate seeing from your shop?
Yes. Unfortunately, the news is even worse. I'm working with Richard Florida right now, looking at this very topic for all 50 states and 53 of the largest metros throughout the United States. And it is just as bad, but amplified even more. We're looking at billions of dollars lost within just that 4-month period, and millions of jobs. And again, keep in mind that so many people in the creative industries, in the arts, have more than one job, and they've lost all of those jobs.
Yeah, well, as everybody who's participating in today's program knows, the United States has taken a very different approach to cultural policy at a federal level forever, and has thought very differently about how to fund cultural policy or fund the arts. This, presents just a significant challenge, obviously, in terms of how do we align resources to try to help get over this hump, because again, it's very clear this is an open-ended problem that I think anyone would be foolish to make a guess in terms of when things are back to any sense of normal. Certainly, states like Colorado, which have been more successful than most in terms of doing limited reopenings and trying to get some models of some music back, still, though there's no real pathway forward in the short term without venues putting on shows at a significant loss, and then you've got extra expenses due to sanitation, all the things that we're talking about in the RES program. So as I said at the beginning of the program, I just really hope that this data, not only about the state of Colorado, but about those other 50 some odd markets, can get into circulation as quickly as possible so policymakers can understand the scale of this as they're thinking about funding priorities in the next wave of stimulus.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, we have a good question coming in from Danny Grant asking what percentage of music industry income is not reported, and also what is that multiplier that you referenced?
Yes, that is an excellent point. One other thing you have to remember, not just in the music industry, but in all of the arts, so much is unreported. The music industry, there's no actual percentage guess of how much is unreported, but as I'm sure many of us know firsthand, a lot of it is unreported. So you have to think about that as well. And in terms of her second question, the multipliers. Generally, you're looking at somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 for a job in the creative industry. Meaning that if you have a job in the creative industry, let's say in the film industry, everything that you are spending money on in your job, the things that you're buying for your job, basically supports 1.5 to 2.5 jobs in other industries, whether that is the person working at the 7-Eleven where you're doing a film shoot or the person selling you film stock. So that's basically what you're looking at. And then it gets even more complex if you say, what about at your local independent venue? You go out for a night to see a show, well, you're probably going to eat something at a restaurant that's close by. Maybe you'll make a day out of it and spend an overnight stay at a hotel. Then you have more money trickling into the economy. So again, this is really a conservative estimate in jobs lost and revenue lost.
Yeah. No, well, Michael, stick with this. We're going to be coming back to you in a second. Thank you for sharing that sobering data. And I want to bring Lisa Gedgaudas in from Denver Arts and Venues and Create Denver. Lisa, thanks for joining us today. So that's a bummer, but that's, it's important that we're getting that sense of granularity and detail. And actually, I'm going to start your segment just by tossing you a really good question that's come in from Alicia Smith asking, basically getting those numbers, what should entertainment professionals do at this point? Is there enough potential support to hold out and wait for jobs to return? Or is it time for professionals to plan on pivoting? Is there enough potential support from policymakers, and is this just going to be the new normal? Is there going to be permanent loss as well? I mean, what are you seeing in Denver? How is your community trying to respond to the crisis? And what advice are you giving to your community in terms of artists and others that want to work in creative industries?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. I don't know how to follow up the words total carnage very well, but I'll try. And I think, to give a little background with my agency, it's Denver Arts and Venues. So we're a little different than Margaret, where we're outside of the city budget. We're run by our venues like Red Rocks and our Performing Arts Complex and a few others. And I'm on the art side supporting creative industries. So it's been so key to have Michael and Margaret in lockstep throughout the past few years on this. And we're excited to have this data come out, even and especially in trying times right now, because it certainly puts us to work in the way that we've already been mobilizing, right? Mm-hmm. So having that methodology be the same throughout the state and city, and aligning that kind of symbolic partnership to advocate for more money, whether it's at the federal, state, or local level. I could talk for a second on Red Rocks too. Being outside of the city budget, we're relying on Red Rocks revenue to pay for our staff and all of our other venues and upkeep. But we're looking at what we would typically make in a year of about 54 million, and expenses being around 48. In COVID times, we're looking at projecting 8 million in revenue, and trying to redistribute how we do expenses, but our expenses are 14 to 18 million. So we feel it in our own space. And so certainly it's our job to deploy ourselves to show up for our community right now. I've done a lot of legwork with other partners to talk to our music venues. We've had a lot of Zoom calls, one-on-one, a lot of therapy sessions. But it's so important and key to be talking to folks in the creative community and let them speak out about their needs, whether it's our venues or our artists or, patrons of the arts looking to help support better. But more specifically, right now we're using that data. The city had some CARES Act funding come in, and we were able as arts and venues to apply for $2.5 million. And that really would go to artists, an artist relief fund that we started back in April that was exhausted within 3 weeks of opening, to replenish that, as well as support creative businesses, non and for profit. And then our venues, both performing arts and music venues. We're worried about everyone, but we're really concerned about our music venue establishments. Mm-hmm. We're looking at a loss of about 90% of them across the nation if this rate keeps going. And the assumption is we don't open until 2021. So that data directly aligns with that advocacy to fight for that 2.5 million, which again is not that much money, but it's something. We can leverage that money with other philanthropic dollars, and I think that's always the goal, is like, how do we leverage this and get this story out? We want the press to pick this up. We're glad to be sharing it with this group today, but we hope to have it out next week, and we really want our press to kind of put the pressure on too and get these numbers out. And then on a more national level, I think, you know, as a city and as the state, it's been so important to connect with our other cities across the nation and the globe. I've been sitting on the NIVA weekly meetings, which is the National Independent Venues Association, and they've got over 2,000 members since April, and they're doing a ton of lobbying efforts. Right now, they have an open letter to Congress looking for regulatory assistance for venues. They're also going to be asking for, I think it's Restart Act money to provide benefits for venues as well. So this open letter they put out has over 1 million people that have signed it, you know, celebrities, musicians, and otherwise. So it's got some strong pull there. And then they're also trying to raise about $100 million towards the venue to kind of keep them open. And that's the difficulty too, and not to just pivot on music, but, you know, they were the first to close and they'll be the last to open. And we're looking at, you know, application questions like, are you 0 to 3 months, 3 to 6, 6 to 9, 9 to 12? How soon do you need this money? Even knowing that they may still close, how do we let them survive a little bit longer in case other tools in the toolkit come out? So it's a group effort. You know, there's stuff we can be doing on the ground here. But again, resources are scarce and everyone's going through that. So I think getting on a more national scale to advocate for these funds is key. So again, hats off to Michael for all his work on this. We're just glad to get it out as soon as possible. And I would suggest too that in order not to reinvent the wheel, not that we don't want Michael to get hired for more things like this, but I would say to our cities or leadership, please use this data as your own. This could be, you know, certainly translated over to your own cities, although different in size and population and all that. But I think that this is a good model to just share out with your own leadership if you can take it and run with it. Yeah, that's my high level.
That's a lot. You got a lot going on there. Thank you, Lisa. And Margaret, I'd like to bring you back in, just hearing Michael Seaman's presentation and just sort of the scale of the challenge facing the state. What are some of the things that what are some of your takeaways? How do you respond to that?
Well, this information is really helpful, and we will be sharing it with our colleagues across the country as well. We launched an initiative called the Colorado Music Relief Fund at the end of May, and it was an incredible group of people in the music industry thinking about not only the musicians who have lost their income, but all of their back of house folks, the gig workers, the sound engineers, the lighting engineers, the people who take your tickets and ushers who take you to your seats and all of that. And did a concert, which was interesting. We got our local television station to give us an hour commercial free on a Saturday night. And in that one night, we were able to raise, and I mean, there were incredible musicians who stepped up and donated their time and talent to do this. People like Nathaniel Rateliff and Michael Franti and the Lumineers and Brandy Carlisle and Dave Matthews and on and on and on and on. But in that one night, we were able to raise close to $625,000 through sponsorships and donations. And so I think the most important thing was showing these performers, some of them performing in an empty venue, right? So it was a very powerful visual image, performing in an empty Red Rocks or performing in an empty Pepsi Center stage. And, the donations continue to come in, which is really heartening that every one of us who enjoy live music can relate to the impact that it's had in our state. So, it's always the musicians who step up in a time of need, whether it's a wildfire or a flood or helping with food banks or helping people in the hospitality industry who've lost their jobs. They're always the first to step up and offer to help. And for me, that's really what needs to happen in our nation, where we need to be more focused on caring about other people and our communities in a more altruistic, compassionate, unselfish way. So it's been pretty profound for me.
Margaret, I want to build on that because I think that's such an important point and something we talk about on this program fairly often, but I just love the way you talked about it just now, and I know this is something that you carry very, very close in your heart, this sense that a lot of the people that do the work that we do it out of an obligation or recognition that there's a disconnect between the importance of music for our lives and for humanity and for community and for empathy, and how that gets reflected in the commercial structures of that industry. And the importance of all of us, whether you work in the public sector or as an advocate or a researcher or a nonprofit leader or wherever you fit, to be really intentional about how we build stronger structures that can do better by musicians and do better by that community. And I think part of the bitter irony of the last 3 months is just your point. In a time of crisis, that's where we turn, and we're used to that. And we know that musicians are going to be extraordinarily generous. They're going to try to give voice to feelings and emotions and grief that we need as human beings. But the fact that this is happening at the exact same time that their entire economic ecosystem is collapsing is even that much more melancholy, and a lot of, I think, what we collectively are thinking about is, this is a moment in time. This will end. There will be a new beginning. We don't know when that's going to be. We don't know what that looks like, but I know that all of us feel redoubled in our commitment to making sure that whatever comes next is stronger and better and more resilient and more equitable and more thoughtful and intentional about where do musicians fit into that ecosystem and how do we support them. Lisa, I know you guys in Denver have been thinking a lot about what's been happening in the streets and a lot of the very challenging things that are happening in most American cities related to equity and justice, and where does music fit into that conversation. We were really excited 2 weeks ago to have Nikki Swarn from The Drop in Denver talk a lot about what's happening in the Denver music community related to platforms and opportunity. I know you're doing some things at the city level to be more connected into those conversations. Is that right? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Sure. It's a good example of how we've been trying to support the Black Lives Matter movement, as well as our, Black, Indigenous, and people of color in communities and our artists. How do we find ways to activate them and provide a platform for them right now, especially as a city? Little do people realize we work for them, and we do. And to activate just that mentality alone and make sure our creative community knows that. We've been asking a lot in ways, building platforms online for them to talk out about ways that they could get more involved in selection processes for public art, or, make it more inclusive. And we're coming up with more and more lists. And some of it doesn't cost a dime. And that's what's really important too. One of the examples though is that COVID happened and we weren't having city council meetings in person, but once they started again was right around when all the stuff was going on with George Floyd. And I thought, okay, we need to re-up this program we used to do, which was once a month, pay $200 for an artist to come in and perform at the top of the hour for 5 minutes at a city council meeting. And what better timing than to really reach out to our community of color and say, we're providing you a platform, you're knocking on the door already. How about let's do this through a creative process? We have an artist next week going in named AP, Anthony Price, and he just put out a great video a few weeks ago called Freedom, so he's going to be performing that. So if, again, cities can find ways to provide a platform, I encourage it. Steal ideas from other people. Put murals on the ground, whatever it takes.
Yeah. We have a great question in from Kate Becker talking about, I don't know that stealing is where Kate is going with this, maybe leveraging or building off of, but are there some other states or regions that are doing this kind of depth of critical creative economy research that Colorado is? Who else is out there doing this kind of mapping, or even internationally? Michael, you mentioned that there's some folks that you've been tagged in on who've been thinking about these questions.
Yes, I mean, I would imagine someone is. I don't know, though. I am, with Richard Florida, looking at all 50 states, all 53 metropolitan regions, over 1 million people. And we're finishing up. We're waiting to get it out, basically. Mm-hmm. And I know Kate hit me up. We can talk. Because I have, I think, both Seattle and Washington.
Yeah. Well, and I think more broadly, certainly, again, pre-COVID, the whole notion of having an appropriately funded, coordinated, sort of integrated research agenda for the field is something that certainly Music Policy Forum and other organizations have thought about, again, going back to a lot of the legacy quantitative work that was pioneered by Future Music Coalition and others, that when you have, again, a music community, or excuse me, when you make policy by intuition or gut, it's a very different thing than making policy by having numbers behind it. And this has been a particular challenge in the 20-year evolution of the music community from an analog industry to a digital industry, because there's been a lot of feelings of like, well, I think people are selling T-shirts, or I think people are making money on the road, or I feel like this is happening. And again, a lot of that is helpful and true, and oftentimes is validated. But when you can actually run the numbers and put it behind it, not only is that helpful in advocacy, which is helpful and that's part of the puzzle, but really it unlocks other questions and other things that we need to be thinking about or looking at. And so that was, one of the major, as I was saying before to Margaret, it's always, it's important to think about what was the core work before the crisis made us do things like this. And that was part of the core work for my nonprofit, is thinking about, okay, how do we elevate the research conversation and bring more intention and scale to it? Because, as great as Michael Seaman is, and I appreciate your generosity both today and in terms of hitting you up, we need 25 researchers, all around the place. And that, clearly there are really, really smart, really thoughtful people all over the country that are thinking about this stuff. And part of what excites us also is just the, not to say you're old, Michael, but there's a generational dynamic here as well. As we think about, this is part of what's exciting about the program that you're helping build out at CSU, is that there's a generational relationship to technology, where we need people to be in the research field who have a fundamentally different relationship to technology to think about how do we design the research agenda moving forward. So it's not, part of what you and I come from in terms of sort of, analog kids trying to put that into a digital context. It's like no, we need people who are digital natives really being empowered to figure out what are the things they want to ask. Because, for me, I don't mean put words in your mouth, but certainly for me, part of what's fun, exhilarating, but also challenging about these times is just understanding where the marketplace is going to evolve as new technologies come online. I didn't see TikTok coming. I wouldn't have guessed TikTok was going to be the next big one. So, well, you guys have been great, and I'm going to go around and just ask if you have any, sort of closing thoughts or anything again for our audience members. And it's just great to see everybody who's participating today and watching the program. We have a lot of public officials, we have international representation, we've got just a great diversity of stakeholders here today. if there's just one last thing you would like to leave them with, or a call to action in terms of something that, if they wanted to dig deeper, where would you send them? What would be a good thing for them to do if they haven't had an opportunity to, to do something? So, Lisa, I'm going to make you go first with that very vague and unfair question.
Yeah, I have like 40 answers to that. But, stay positive as leaders and stay in conversation with your community. Reach out to creative sector in each sector and try and allow that platform. I think that's the most important thing right now, is for them to be heard. And then on the back end, work your tail off to support lobbying efforts locally and federally. And again, research, man. These numbers speak volumes, so use what you can to leverage more money.
Margaret Hunt, thank you so much for joining us. Is there any parting words you'd leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I would say that reach out to your state or regional arts organization and let your voice be heard. Call upon them, step up and offer your help and expertise. I echo what Lisa said about lobbying efforts in this just most recent legislative session here in Colorado that just ended a few weeks ago. We were in jeopardy of losing all of our funding as an agency. And it was people in the community who wrote letters to their legislators and made phone calls that turned that around. So I just really encourage you to think about that and work with either your state advocacy organization. I'm being very U.S. kind of centric in my comments here, but just make your voice be heard with the organizations that are in a position of power and influence to help you.
Yeah. Mike Seaman, you got anything?
Sure. I don't want to sound like a cliche. I mean, this is an absolutely horrible time, but we have around the world an enormous amount of highly skilled, talented, creative individuals that are now unemployed. Think about ways to get them to work together on projects across disciplines, involve technology, involve healthcare, involve music, and see what can happen. Find ways to support that sort of structure, change within the government. If it's even like a New Deal era federal arts project sort of situation at whatever level of government. But I think this is a great, great opportunity that we can push the creative economy and the products that are coming out of it to the next level.
Michael, I love that as a closing statement and closing thought. Thank you to you. Thank you, Margaret Hunt. Thank you, Lisa Gedgaudas. As always, we love Colorado. We love what you're doing. Thanks to all of you, again, who joined us this week for our program. As always, Alex Dolman, our awesome producer, will be putting the archive up online over the weekend. So if you saw today's program and thought friends or colleagues would enjoy it, send them the link. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, encouragement, hopefully mostly good stuff, feel free to hit us up always at musicpolicyforum@gmail.com. We've got a banger of a show next week. Not that this week wasn't good, but next week is going to be really good. So that announcement will be coming out on Tuesday. We're excited for it. Have a great rest of your Friday, everybody, and thank you so much for being with us. Bye now.